All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to How to Optimize Your Drupal Site with Structured Content. My name is Dave Sawyer. Before we get into the talk, just a brief bit about me. I'm a senior solutions architect with FFW. My background is in consulting and Drupal development. And if you've never heard of FFW, we're one of the sponsors of DrupalCamp today. We're a full-service digital agency, global agency with offices around the world. We're actually the largest Drupal agency at this point. Our client portfolio includes Pfizer, NBC, Stanford University, City of Copenhagen, and others. And you can check out about our work on giving back to the Drupal community if you go up to drupal.org/FFW. So, a little bit about what we're going to talk about in today's session. What is structured content? We'll kind of put a specific definition around that phrase. We'll talk about some of the benefits of why structured content's important in terms of optimizing your website. We'll talk about some of the technical details and the nitty-gritty of how to do that with structured data markup and schema.org. We'll talk about specific Drupal implementation, modules and other approaches for Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. I'll recommend some specific tools you can use for optimizing your site with structured content. Speak briefly on some workflow techniques and auto tagging, and some social sharing optimizations with structured content as well. And I'll close by describing why I believe Drupal and Drupal 8 is the best CMS for structured content. But before I go any further, let me just get a sense of who's in the room. Just quick show of hands, how many people are developers? Okay, a couple. Site builders? Cool. Project management? Cool. Anyone that didn't raise their hand, what aspect of?
Technical writing, content management,
Awesome.
But I'm keen on this because a lot of what technical writing about or big push is structured content and structured authoring, right?
Yep.
And data and things like that.
Great, thank you. Helps me to understand a little bit who's in the room. This requires no technical knowledge per se. We're not going to get too technical. I will be mentioning some technical items, but we're trying to keep this high level to talk about what structured data is, what structured content is, and how you can use it in your various jobs. So, a little bit of context. If we look back, those of you who have been in web design or web development for many years, like I have, the web used to be a place of pages. Every URL led to a page or a file download. And I think if you take a look at what's going on, please.
Sorry.
Forgot to. The web has changed from a place where we're just finding pages to the web is full of things, objects, concepts. So a lot of the idea of structured content has to do with a change in the direction of the web at large. It has to do with making data meaningful. Instead of just having a page with some HTML in it, it's about enriching that HTML to describe what the data actually is. It's about making data discoverable, surfaceable. This image I really like. This is from one of my favorite radio programs, This American Life, their website. You can see here ways to explore by date, by tag, by contributor, by location, allowing visitors to browse through the content in a number of ways. And these types of browsing techniques are made possible by structuring the content and the data in a variety of ways. It's about making data understandable, not only to humans but to machines. With the wave of voice recognition and artificial intelligence, all made possible because the data can be interpreted by programs and machines and applications. And lastly, connecting data to other data. We here at DrupalCamp are big fans of Drupal as a backend and as a platform and as a system, but there are many others around the web. It's important that they are all able to work together. So structured content is not just about the CMS, but it's about enabling the data to interact with other data to make it more useful to everybody. So, in using this phrase structured content or sometimes structured data, let's put a specific definition around it. What is structured content? Structured content is content that is separated into parts and enriched with meaning through taxonomy and machine-readable metadata. So let's break that down real quick. Content that is separated into parts. So at a fundamental level for a page, we have a header, a body, and a footer, right? But even within that, we have parts within the page. And then enriched with meaning. instead of just saying header, body, footer, what's in the body? What is the meaning of the body? What is the page about? What's the subject matter? What's the topic of the page? And the way that we enrich the page with meaning is by using taxonomy, in other words, tagging, right? Or metadata. That could be in the form of meta tags, or that could be something called structured data markup, which we'll be talking about in this session today. For those of you who are taking notes, this will all be posted online, and this whole session is being recorded as well. Be moving quickly through some of these slides. So structured content, then, is content that's highly organized and predictable. It's consistent and it's predictable. So with this idea of structured content, we have a new practice, which I call structured content optimization. Sort of a brother or a sister to the idea of SEO. And that is the idea of making content more understandable to search engines and other systems through increased metadata and adherence to open standards. And in the session today, we'll be giving you some specific examples of these types of optimizations that you can do to your site. So, what are the benefits of adding more structure to your site content? For me, the best way to describe the benefits of structured content are to take a look at this list of 8 qualities of well-structured content. I'm going to walk through very briefly each one of these 8 items right now. Number 1, well-structured content is understandable. And again, I'll emphasize not only understandable to humans, but understandable to machines, or machine-readable, if you like. Structured content can be understandable to search engines so that the information can be presented to users with further context. So again, we're not just allowing Google to find a bunch of pages on our site. We're allowing Google and other search engines to find specific things that have specific meaning. Structured content is discoverable. When content is more discoverable to users and search engines alike, engagement goes up with your content. Structured content is engaging. Once Google, I use Google a lot because they're certainly a leader in this field, but Google and other systems understand the data on your site, they can start to present it in ways that are more helpful and useful to the user. Does anyone in the audience use the Google application on their iPhone or the Google Now product? Right? Where, for example, I live in the Boston area, and so I got an email with my Amtrak train reservation into my Gmail account, and Google understands that that's not just an email, but it's a train reservation. So the Google application pops up a little reminder that I should leave my house to get to the train at a certain time. And this sort of application is made possible, again, by making the data understandable. Structured content is adaptive. By adding lots of structure to content, we can more easily adapt it to different platforms, to different formats, and to different devices. Structured content is reusable. This one's particularly important to publishers. The ability to repurpose content according to the platform or the context or the channel of the user. Content that is structured is more shareable. If it is enriched with metadata formats, such as Open Graph, for example, that content is going to convey more context and quite frankly, just look better when it is previewed on social platforms or when it's shared online. Structured content is translatable. Content that's been broken out into fields and parts and presented with semantic structure is just easier to translate and maintain in terms of multilingual environment for a global audience. And finally, structured content is consistent. That once you add structure to your content, that the content follows that same structure over time. So, structured data markup. This is the idea that we're enriching our content with a specific means of letting machines and other systems and other applications understand what it is. Best example of this, people ask, clients at FFW ask us a lot about, is that when you do a search engine on Google, some search engine results seem kind of special, right? For example, I was interested in searching for Hamilton tickets, And I noticed that when I search for the tickets here, some additional, what do they call, rich results come up. We can see on the top example. Here we have some 5-star rating and review information that automatically appears in the search result on Google. And below, we have some specific dates. So Google here demonstrating that it understands that one is a show that has reviews and ratings, and that the other it represents an event that has dates. And these types of rich results are made possible through structured data markup. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Structured data markup refers to a text-based organization of data that's included in a file and served from the web, and it describes the things on the web along with their properties. And it uses something called the schema.org vocabulary. How many people are already using schema.org on their Drupal site? Cool. Basically what schema.org is an open community effort to promote standard structured data in a variety of applications. In other words, it provides a vocabulary to describe specific types of things that we find on the web. Examples include products, places, people, organizations, events, much like the Hamilton example that we saw. And schema.org is the open standard that defines what the attributes of all of these different type things are. So in other words, when you're implementing structured data markup in your Drupal site, really what you're doing is you're adhering to an open standard. So if your Drupal site has events on it, for example, the name of the game is to use the schema.org open standard to describe the event information on your site in the same way that other systems are describing information about events. So that when Google and other search engines scan your site, they say, an event, great. It knows what it is, it knows it has a date, etc. I'll be describing a few of the technical elements here, but we're not going to get too technical in the talk. Schema.org refers to a set of vocabularies, a way to describe data. And then on your site, when your developers are actually implementing the site, there are a number of choices on the specific coding and the specific technical implementation of how they implement the schema.org standards. There are 3 main encodings that are supported by schema.org. I'll just briefly describe what they are, and I'll make a recommendation for those of you who are interested in implementing this on your Drupal site. They're called Microdata, RDFA, and JSON-LD. So if this sounds scary to anyone, no worries. I'm going to kind of demystify. We'll just show you what this stuff actually looks like. So the idea of microdata is it exposes additional data right inside of the HTML code. So if we think a common HTML tag like h1 or div, for example, the idea of microdata is it adds some just additional attributes that go right inside of the HTML code that give that h1 or that div specific meaning. And it does that by using a couple of specific attributes called item scope and item prop. I'll just give you a quick example. Here's a chunk of HTML. In this case, we're seeing a chunk of HTML in a div tag that's describing the movie Avatar. And what we see highlighted here are just the additional attributes that say, hey, this div tag is actually a movie. And the URL you see at the top of the div tag points to the schema.org vocabulary, which defines what a movie is. So a machine can say, oh, this is a movie. I can go understand what a movie is. And furthermore, inside we see properties of the movie, like the genre, the year, the director, etc. So instead of requiring an artificial intelligence algorithm to scan some HTML and figure out what that HTML is, we're telling the machines, here's exactly what this information is, and here are the attributes of that information. RDFA is another format for implementing schema.org. Similar approach to what we just looked at with microdata. The data is embedded inside of the HTML. It uses a different set of attributes, in this case property and type of. And this one is of particular note because it's the default format for both Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. So just by using Drupal, even if you don't realize it, RDFA is built right into Drupal. And this would be the format that, in general, I would recommend for use with Drupal, just because it's built into Drupal's core. Let's take a little quick look at what that looks like. Here's a simple RDFA example. Again, a chunk of HTML code, another div tag. In this case, we see a div tag describing a person, in this case myself. And again, we are just adding additional attributes to plain old HTML that help to describe what this chunk of HTML actually is. In this case, we're saying it's a person. Here's the person's name. Here's their phone number, etc. So a machine could parse this and extract, this is a person. Here's his phone number. The last of the three formats used for implementing schema.org is called JSON-LD, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation for Linked Data. It's a mouthful. The main difference between this one and the other two we just looked at is that this one uses JavaScript code. So instead of using HTML with little parameters in it, the data itself is in JavaScript format. So it's not as easy as for humans to read. If you can read HTML, you can read the other two pretty well. But what it does is it provides a nice separation of the data and the content. So if you think of HTML as layout and structure and formatting to the content, and then the data itself, in this case, is in JavaScript. This is Google's recommended format for implementing schema.org to achieve rich snippets and otherwise. But again, in Drupal, because RDFA is built right in most cases, I would recommend using that. Here's an example of what JSON-LD data looks like. We can see now, instead of a chunk of HTML with div tags, we see just some JavaScript code that's been formatted in a certain way, where the specific data attributes are passed. Question? That's okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, my question is kind of broad. How are they so different than, let's say, programming some sort of XML? Because to me, it sounds very similar, where XML is a little bit flexible, where you kind of set up similar tags to do the same function. So what's the difference versus using XML versus what it needs?
So these are designed to be embedded in web pages, right? So these would be embedded right inside of HTML pages. These are all designed to. They came out at different times and have been adopted by different parts of the open source community and otherwise. So there would be reasons to use one or another. As I said, Google is officially now recommending one in particular, JSON-LD. In Drupal, we use another. At the end of the day, there are three different ways to accomplish the same thing, which is to add more structure to the HTML data and to describe what the HTML data is about. Does that answer your question?
Yes and no.
Okay. Let's I'll circle back at the end and see if we can chat more about that. Did you have a question as well?
Actually, I do. Is there a reason that the Drupal community prefers when RDFA versus JSON?
That's a good question. I don't know of the official answer. I can say that RDF support has been built into Drupal for years, for a really long time. And my impression is that JSON-LD is newer. So that may be the reason right there. Yep.
Seems to me that, like, say I have one HTML page and I have two persons on there. I have, like, it's John Lennon and Monica Mason. How do I tie, like, I don't know, actually, no, you wouldn't have to tie this JSON to a particular HTML element, right?
Yes, I think I understand what you're asking. So for the purposes of demonstrating just quick example slides, I've really simplified the code just to provide something. But this would be tied to elements in the HTML document.
Okay, so you would pair them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
right, and again, it's the same concept if I go back. Same concept of doing something like this, but instead of having the data inside of the HTML, the data is off to the side in code.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. So that's just a quick high-level overview of what schema.org is and what the formats are used to implement schema.org. Let's take a look at what it means to implement this with Drupal. Structured content within Drupal is kind of broken down into the different functional areas of Drupal. There are 6 in particular that I'll point out. HTML markup itself is structured, so that's your templates. The metadata, which you can manage using the meta tag module, which I'll speak more about shortly. Structured data markup, which we just talked about, which is the implementation of schema.org. Entity structure, in other words, the content types, the fields, the specific field structure that you give your information. Taxonomy, so the different tagging and taxonomy vocabularies used to tag and describe and categorize your content. And finally, sitemap, and specifically an XML sitemap. So these are some of the main ways that we enable more structured content within Drupal. In the session today, we're really focusing on number 3 here. So we spoke briefly about this idea of RDF. As I said, it's built right into Drupal. If you're curious, look inside any of your Drupal sites, 7 or 8. You'll find right in the core modules folder an RDF module right there. RDF stands for Resource Description Framework. It's a W3C standard for data modeling and sharing, in other words, for managing structured data, structured content. And it enables semantically enriched output for Drupal sites. There's actually a really great video overview that describes this in much more detail than I'm going in today at the YouTube URL on this slide. And RDF-A specifically refers to the idea of RDF embedded inside of the HTML, using a technique similar to what we described here. So for those of you that want to read further on how RDF-A is integrated with Drupal, the URL at the bottom of this slide is really good and provides some good documentation on that. Again, going into more detail than we have time to today. But at a high level, I mean, some of you mentioned that you're in kind of the content and writing side. The name of the game is making sure that as we're entering content into our system and editing the content, that we have a workflow and a process to enrich the content with the other types of information, whether they be tags or RDF information. Okay, how to implement schema.org in your Drupal site. At a high level, there's 3 main pieces. Number 1, you create a structured content type in Drupal. Now that could be anything as simple as a blog post to an article, to some custom content type that you came up for your organization, like a product type. And you give it lots of specific fields that describe the content. Number 2, you identify which of the schemas from schema.org match your content type. And schema.org has many different vocabularies. The most common ones are people, events, products, those types of things. So the use case is here, your content type is a type of thing that schema.org, the open standard, has a description for. And once you've identified which one of the vocabularies or schemas on schema.org is closest to your content type in Drupal, the name of the game is creating a mapping of the fields on your content type to the schema.org properties. And by creating that mapping, you're teaching search engines like Google how to understand your data. Let's go a little bit into more detail here. So this is a screenshot of the actual schema.org website, where what this is showing is the event schema. So someone looking up how the schema.org describes events in an abstracted way. And basically this gives you a reference of all the different aspects of events that are documented for schema.org. To implement this with Drupal, as with most things, the process is a little different depending on if you're using Drupal 7 or Drupal 8. So let's talk briefly about each one. For Drupal 7, it's really simple. There's a module called the schema.org module. You can go to Drupal.org and download it. And what it does, quite simply, is it enables all of those schema.org vocabularies right inside of your Drupal site. So when you create a content type in Drupal, it allows you to create those mappings right inside of Drupal very easily. Specifically, it adds a schema.org settings panel to the content type screen where you're setting up your content type. And that's where you define what type of schema you're using. And then it provides a simple UI to map field by field to the schema properties. There's actually a great video walkthrough of this by Stefan Korlesket using schema.org in Drupal 7 at the URL at the bottom of this slide. I've got a couple screenshots just to give you a sense of it here. This is showing the screen in Drupal where someone is customizing the configuration of the blog content type. You see down at the bottom it adds a little schema.org settings area. And what's nice about it is it provides an autocomplete so that you don't have to go to schema.org and be like, which one is this? You can kind of start typing and it gives you all the possible matches of schema.org schemas. And similarly, it adds a field-by-field mapping. So for each field on your content type, whether it's a built-in field or a custom field you created, similarly it gives you an autocomplete. So you're mapping what are the available schema fields that it understands. If you're using Drupal 8, similarly there's a module that you can use. It's called the schema.org configuration tool, also known as the RDF UI module. The URL for that is at the bottom of the slide. And it uses a slightly different, but it uses the same approach of mapping from your content type to a schema, and then fields within your content type to schema properties. quick look at what that looks like. The configuration tool provides the UI to do the mapping, and there's actually a video walkthrough that goes into much more detail than I'll be going into today. If you want to kind of see this step by step, the specific YouTube video here is a really helpful video that shows this exact module in use. A couple screenshots just to give you a sense of it. This is a Drupal 8 website where what we're seeing here is someone editing the article content type, and again we see schema.org mappings on the lower left, and then the ability to map this article to, in this case, the article schema. And here also is a screenshot from a Drupal 8 site using this module where I'll bring your attention over to the right-hand column where it says status. It's giving a nice indication of which fields in Drupal have been mapped and which ones haven't. Cool. I'm going to go into some of the recommended tools that you can use to test if this stuff is working once you start doing these mappings and enriching your data in this way. One tool is the Google Structured Data Testing Tool. This basically provides a way for you to test out URLs to see if Google can actually find the additional structured data that you've embedded in your site, and to see if it understands it correctly. It provides a variety of ways to test and to make updates on the fly as you're kind of prototyping, get this working. So a little bit of trial and error to get this working, but this tool will tell you if it's correctly set up. Kind of looks like this. You go to the Structured Data Testing tool, and in this case, it gives you an option to either test a specific URL on your site, or you can paste in a chunk of code that you're testing. But let's say you've enriched your data on your Drupal site, you have a URL, and you want to see, hey, is Google going to understand this? You just paste in the URL, you click Run Test, and then it gives you a screen something like this, where it's showing you on the left is the HTML source code of the page that you're testing, and on the right it's giving you some feedback in terms of errors and warnings and things that you need to address to make sure that the data is implemented correctly. And again, you can use any of the formats that we've discussed today. So in case of Drupal sites that are using RDFA, this is going to work great. Another tool you can use is called the Structured Data Markup Helper. Also a Google tool. All of these tools are free. This shows you how to update your site so Google and other systems can understand the data that it already contains. Take a quick look at what this one looks like. So here's a screenshot of the tool. You can see that you start by choosing a type of data. This shows articles, businesses, movies, products, software applications, etc. So for this example screenshot, I chose articles, and I just pasted in a link to an article from the Washington Post, and the New York Times, rather. Sorry, and you can see what it's showing here. On the left is a preview of the page you pasted in, and on the right, what this represents is the ability to go into the source code and essentially identify the pieces of data that you need to enrich with structured data. And it gives you an interface to be able to interact with these pieces. So for example, what we see here is the yellow border around this image. When we click on the image, it's showing us highlighted in yellow the specific image in the code and where the attributes of the structured data are located. Before I move on, any questions on structured data and schema.org? Cool. I'd like to speak briefly to the concept of auto-tagging, which I believe is a really powerful and yet underused method to enrich data with structured content in Drupal. And the idea of auto-tagging, as the name suggests, is to have tagging happen automatically, or the suggestion of tags happen automatically, based on analyzing content and metadata. So describe a little bit more what this looks like. At a high level, there's sort of two types of auto-tagging. One involves a third-party system that is externally of the website or the Drupal site that kind of analyzes your content, and then based on scraping and analyzing the content, comes up with some tags or categorization attributes that can be applied to that content. An example of this is a tool called OpenCalais by Thomson Reuters. But the other type of auto-tagging, which is a lot simpler, is CMS-driven auto-tagging, meaning there's no third-party system, no third-party tools, that Drupal has been configured to automatically apply tags based on some predefined criteria. So I'll give you some example use cases of where that could come in really handy. Number one, combined criteria. We've done a lot of work for publishers where you have different teams, maybe different editorial teams, or maybe more of a site administration team and an editorial team, who are tagging and marking up content in different ways. And so you can have essentially a rule that says, if Team A adds some tags or attributes to the content, and then Team B also adds certain tags and attributes to content, if certain conditions apply in both cases, automatically apply this tag or this category. So the idea is that it's sort of self-organizing. The website is sort of self-organizing in that way. So predefined criteria that gets automatically applied in the form of tags. Another really common one is importing content. If you have a website that imports content, like via feeds, that based on attributes of the content you're pulling in, it can automatically apply tags. For example, we batch import a bunch of articles. And for every article that has this keyword or phrase in the title, automatically tag it or categorize it with this. As opposed to importing all the content and then later having a curation or editorial process where you go through the content and sort of sort and file it. Workflow or event-based tagging. So again, when an example of this would be, let's say an editor decides to feature a certain story on the homepage of the website, that just by placing that story on the homepage, it might automatically get tagged featured, right? So that later the editorial team can say, let me see a list of all articles or stories that have not been previously featured on the homepage. And lastly, time-based, based on some time criteria, based on time passing or otherwise, tags can automatically be applied. So how do you do this type of functionality, auto-tagging? As with before, the approach is different for Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. For Drupal 7, there are a few more options. In fact, there's a great page up on Drupal.org that describes many different modules that you can use to implement auto-tagging in a number of ways. In fact, this page is so detailed that it goes into much more detail than I can go in today. But if you're interested in looking at a variety of ways you can implement auto-tagging on Drupal 7, this page gives you a great summary of what you can do. I'll just show one example approach here, one or two. There's a module called the Taxonomy Auto-Tagger module, which allows a vocabulary to be searched against for suggestions of terms related to the content of Node. So the idea is that if you're using freeform tagging as opposed to like checkboxes, after a while, your tags there can be hundreds or thousands of tags in your site, and you can't remember all of the tags that you've used before. So if you're interested in having Drupal actually say, okay, we think this article is about cats, it would actually display a cats tag as an existing tag for you. And this just helps to keep your content organized and to take advantage of the Drupal CMS in that way, and suggesting tags. Another example of auto-tagging for Drupal 7 is a module called Rules Auto-Tag. It's as it's self-described, lightweight approach for auto-tagging full-text content by matching taxonomy terms. So specifically what this is doing is when you create a new article or whatever your content type is, it's actually looking at the body text and looking for terms inside of the body text that correlate to tags or categories. And then based on it matching those, gives you a list that you can automatically apply. In Drupal 8, not as many contrib options. In Drupal 7, there's a lot. I fully expect this to change as Drupal 8 continues to be adopted and developed. But at this time, a Drupal 8 solution similar to what we've just described is probably going to involve a little bit more custom development from the dev team. But one example approach to do a suggested tags approach that works with Drupal 8 is a module called the Suggested Terms module, which, similar to what we just described, provides a list of suggested tags or terms that are based on what your content, the body of your content. In terms of tagging, whether you're using auto tagging or manual tagging, this is something that I really wanted to convey in the talk today, which is the use of multiple vocabularies. A lot of sites just use tags, that's it. And everything gets tagged, and there's tags for everything. But the idea would be to create multiple vocabularies to describe many different aspects of the content. One of the best examples today, I think, is tags that not only describe what the content's about, but who it's for. So for example, public-facing tags that visitors to your website can see would be like topic tags, where they can click on a tag and see other articles that are the same subject matter. But tags can also be private or internal or not customer-facing, that can be used just by the internal team or the editorial team to describe the content in terms of the business logic or the business meaning. So imagine, if you don't already do this, imagine having a vocabulary in Drupal called persona or audience. And the tags or terms describe different types of website visitors. So in a way what you're doing is you're describing who's this article really for? Who did we write it for? Who do we want to read it? And by doing that, a lot of interesting things get possible. So for example, if you move towards implementing personalization on your site, personalization engines like Acquia Lift and others are based on this idea of taking metadata in the content and saying, okay, we think this person, for example, for higher ed, here we're at Princeton, for higher ed website, they want to have certain content pushed to prospective students, different content pushed to parents, different content pushed to alumni. So once the visitor gets recognized by what pages they're browsing, we can start to push more content that was intended for that type of user. And that's all possible by, in the first place, tagging the pages. This is a page that would be of interest to a prospective student. This is a page that would be of interest to an alumni, that sort of thing. Let's touch briefly on social sharing. This is a really, if you're not doing this on your website already, this is a really, in my opinion, a quick win to optimize your site and particularly make your content look much, much better on social media when visitors come to your website and then share your content out on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. How many of you have ever gone to Facebook or LinkedIn and you have a URL you want to share, and so you go to that site and you paste in the URL, and you know it like automatically kind of pulls in a preview, right? Have you ever done that to your site or another site where like either the preview's not there or like it's like that's not the image I'm trying to share, right? Like it gives like the wrong thing, right? And the reason is because it's usually because the site doesn't contain the metadata necessary to describe what should appear there. So Facebook, for example, will do its best to render a little social preview of what it thinks the image should be. But as the people who are building the website, you have control to basically tell Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, use this image for the preview. Use this text for the preview. Here's what the preview should look like. And you can craft that. And that's done through metadata. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. The name of the game is improving the social shareability of your content by using metadata. In this case, there are two standards that you can use. One is called Twitter cards, and the other is called Open Graph. And it's all about making your Drupal content look great when it appears on major social platforms. For those of you in the kind of content side, as we talked about editorial content and writing, I think the name of the game here is having a documented workflow for this. When you enter a new article, when you enter a new piece of content, typically we enter the headline and the body and the byline for the author, that sort of thing. But there's an additional step, which would be to also specify, well, if this is the headline when they view the site, should the same headline appear when they share it, or should that be maybe a shorter version of the headline? So there's a little bit of control over exactly what gets displayed on social media. This is an example of a chunk of HTML where we see at the top of the HTML document some meta tags. And we can see as they're highlighted in red here, this is an example of the Open Graph standard. And all that really is just a little bit of data embedded in the HTML file that describes what the information is about in terms of this open standard called Open Graph, which happens to be used by Facebook, LinkedIn, and others. So here is our opportunity to say this is what the preview should be based on. Similarly, with Twitter, Twitter has their own meta tag format they call Twitter card meta tags. And very same idea, some meta tags that appear in your web page that just tell Twitter what the information is that it should use when people share that page out on Twitter. And this is really super easy to implement in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. there's a module. If you're not already using this module, you definitely should. Any website that isn't private, like an intranet, any public website should be, that's powered by Drupal, should be using this module. It's called MetaTag, and it allows you to have fine-grained, granular control of exactly how your meta tags are set up on your site. And specifically, in this case, it allows you to enable these Open Graph and Twitter card tags. Super easy to do. There's a link for some further reading on that. But at a high level, in non-technical terms, what we're doing is, when we have a content type, like an article, we're going to go into the meta tag module. We're going to tell the meta tag module, on our article, we also want fields for Open Graph and Twitter card tags to show up there, so that when the content teams are entering new content, they can populate those fields or enter them, or at least have some sensible defaults in there that they can override if they'd like to. I'll share a lesson learned from doing this stuff. There are a couple tools that you can use to test how your content looks when it gets shared out into social media without actually sharing it. One is called the Twitter card validator. At the URL you see here, just a quick look of what that looks like. You would paste in the URL to a Drupal page where you've used the meta tag module to put the Twitter card meta tags in, and it would tell you how that would look when it's shared on Twitter. In this case, pasting an URL to a URL on the Washington Post shows me the exact preview. In this case, the Washington Post has leveraged this open standard, and they're giving some fine-grained control over what shows up here. A lot of research has been done that says posts with images in them perform better. So as site producers, we have the opportunity to make sure images show up and which images show up. Similarly, Facebook has a tool, again, where you can kind of test how your pages look when Facebook users share them. It's called the Facebook Sharing Debugger. It requires you to be logged into Facebook, but the URL is here. And same type of idea. When you come to the site, you paste in a URL to one of your Drupal pages, and it's going to render a preview. So here's a screenshot of a blog post that I wrote up on the FFW website, and it's showing me here the image that will come in through on the preview on Facebook, what the title, and what the little teaser text is going to be. And what's interesting about this, I don't know this for sure, but there was a case where before I was using these tools, I was actually like posting it into actual Facebook to see how it was going to look on the preview. And that works fine. The problem is, it seems that Facebook caches that. So what I was doing was, I was like, oh, that's not the image I want, right? I went back to my Drupal site, I changed the image, and went back to Facebook. It still had the old image in there, right? So these tools allow you to test everything, make it work great, so that when you put it out into the wild, you know what to expect.
A workaround we found is if you add a query string with a random thing on it,
Yep.
to Facebook, it'll break the cache.
Yep. Cool. So I'll just summarize why I think Drupal, and Drupal 8 in particular, is the best CMS for structured content. It provides, number one, a great separation of the structure of the content from the presentation of the content. So we have a theme with templates where we do all of our styles and CSS, etc. And then we have the back end, where the content types in the fields. And it gives us a nice separation of those, which is really important for structured content. Number two, it provides excellent tools for managing fielded entities, and by that I just mean content types, essentially. Number three, it provides very powerful taxonomy and tagging features. Number four, it provides native RDF and module support for implementing schema.org, which is becoming increasingly important for SEO and making sure your site shows up properly on Google. And number five, it gives you full-featured meta tag controls through the use of that meta tag module. So that's in a nutshell what structured content is, how to implement schema.org, and a little bit about why Drupal 8 is the best CMS for doing so. I'll take any questions that anybody may have. Cool. Any questions at all? In the back.
On the latter approach, inserting in, can you just talk a little bit more about the difference with taxonomy, using taxonomy then versus the approaches you were just talking about?
The difference between taxonomy and, I'm sorry?
I guess the auto tagging that you were talking about there.
Yeah.
You could potentially do something similar with taxonomy?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let me clarify. So the word taxonomy is certainly it has its own meaning, but it's also sort of a Drupal word, right? In Drupal speak, right, taxonomy is almost synonymous with tagging. Tagging is a type of taxonomy in Drupal. So within this idea of taxonomy or classification of the content, we have tags, which can be free-form tags. You can make them up as you go. Or you can have choosing from a predefined list of categories, more like checkboxes. But all of the above is considered taxonomy in Drupal. So auto-tagging really is a technique for leveraging the taxonomy features of Drupal, but in an automated fashion as opposed to manually typing things in or manually checking the boxes.
So the main difference there is we're following a standard by using the schema.org approach as opposed to a non-standard just inserting tags.
Exactly. What schema.org says is, okay, you can make up tags and categories and you can describe your content in any way you like, but schema.org says, hey, if we're all talking about a person, a product, an event, let's all standardize on how to describe that so that machines, applications like Google, can make that information more useful to the people who use those systems. So schema.org is more about an open standard, a way of describing things, whereas taxonomy in Drupal is the specific functional pieces of the Drupal platform that allow you to tag and categorize. Question?
Is there any analytics that show you which words or tags is most effective in finding out if people actually
Yeah, that is the question, right? So I would say there's no simple answer to that in my opinion. What I will say is that the nature of SEO and any kind of optimization, in this case I was talking about optimizing your site with more structure and metadata, any kind of optimization requires experimentation. Even if you read all of the best books and articles and you say, hey, this is the way to do it, nothing is more meaningful than real data, what your users actually do on your site. So what I would recommend is if you're interested in reaching more users or doing SEO optimization or finding out which keywords to target in that way, is to do some due diligence and homework and reading, but to realize it's going to be an iterative process. You're going to go in, you're going to make some tweaks and changes, and then you're going to look at your analytics report and you're going to see, how are we doing? Right? And then you're going to go back and refine, and this is going to be more of an ongoing process. And you'll learn as you go. I think that's the reality of it.
There's tools in Google Analytics to help you that. So if there's certain words that you know are what you think are your keywords, you can just throw those words in and see how many people actually use that over a certain period of time versus, let's say, another term that might be the same thing, and see what kind of hits other sites have. And say, oh, well, TechCom works better than technical communication, so I should use TechCom as my word or my keyword throughout my site, and that'll get me more hits, and that'll get me, the kind of traffic that I'm looking for. So there's a lot of tools within Google Analytics to kind of give you that feedback on what you have and what you can experiment with.
Absolutely, right? And there's also a lot of studies that show that when you're looking at a page full of search results, that users tend to, their eyes go towards the so-called rich results, the results that have the additional metadata and other context presented with them. So you can do this, and the way to do it is putting that structured data markup in your Drupal site. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, one more in the back. Yeah.
Actually, another one, I'll throw one in. I guess just in terms of challenges related to convincing people for the investment of doing this, the investment of time and resource to...
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say there are a number of, in my opinion, no-brainer, low-hanging fruit, quick wins, call them what you like, that you can take advantage of that don't really represent much of an investment. For example, if you have a Drupal site today, Drupal 7 or 8, and it's a public-facing site, and it's not using the meta tag module, and specifically it's not using things like open graph tags and Twitter cards, it's a free module to install. You can be up and running with it. A developer could set it up for you in like a day. It's really simple. And there's not much training involved with filling in some additional fields. So if you have people that are already used to filling in the title, the body, and maybe one or two other fields, this would be just adding some other fields for them to fill in. And they can be taught, when you fill in this field called the open graph field, that just means what's the title going to be when it's shared on Facebook or LinkedIn, right? So I think the name of the game is taking those first small steps of starting to just do the the pieces that you would be considered to be best practices in SEO, and take advantage of those. And going back to your question, the investment, I think, really beyond those has more to do with technical infrastructure. So particularly if this applies to larger companies where there's not one website, but there's 100 websites. How do you manage content across 100 websites? How do you ensure consistency of data and structure? Is content syndicated from one site to another? It starts to get really complex when you get to the large stuff. But in general, there are a lot of things that you can do for free or with some quick wins, just with schema.org and MetaTag module. Cool. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you.
How's the presentation going to be made available?
Yeah, it's